officially begin the meeting with Pam, our president in Norway. And Pam is going to welcome us to this meeting of the Alamos History Association.
Yes, welcome, welcome. Spain's main interest in Mexico was in precious metals, and the drive for silver led development in northern Mexico under the Spanish Empire. Sometimes the silver was transported in bars. Other times it was minted into coins. Today, Jim Swickard will tell us about minting in Alamos and elsewhere in North America. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you for the welcome. Introduce Jim Swickard. And Jim is an Alamos institution. And I can't say enough about all the wonderful things he's done for our community, but Jim is very much interested in the Alamos Mint, which was right next here to the Hacienda de los Santos. And I'm going to run the PowerPoint that he's got there. Jim, you take it away.
Thank you, Errol. Good to see all of you today. I have good news and bad news. Good news is I did this program, what, 7 or 8 years ago, something like that? Yeah. I had a fair amount of information about the former mint, and today I actually have a little bit more factual information due to some research online and so on. However, I don't have the coins. Oh. They're somewhere in this property, stashed away. And what we'll use will be a few photographs. But it was kind of fun a few years ago to be able to pass those coins around. And lo and behold, I've scoured everywhere. They're going to turn up. I know that.
Are they in the wall? Do you think they're covered?
Nancy was positive they were in a safe.
Oh,
they weren't. But nevertheless, I have, it's very interesting when you start talking about the mint. There's very little written history about the mint that was in Alamos. And thanks to one man by the name of Prado, P-R-A-D-E-A-U. He was a Mexican that was born in Guaymas in 1894, and he became a coin collector, interested in the mints of Mexico, and he wrote a booklet. I wouldn't call it a real book because it wasn't that large, but probably 50 pages or 75 pages on the mints of Mexico. And being from the state of Sonora, should I stand out here?
Yes.
No, right there. Okay, right there. Okay. Being from the state of Sonora, he really did an in-depth study on the Alamos Mint and also the Hermosillo Mint. So if you can go to the next page there. So there's his name, the Mexican mints of Alamos and Hermosillo. I'm just taking that section out of this book, and part of the talk will be about what he learned. And I might add that he was very fortunate. In the 1930s, the last mint master from Alamos was still living. So he was able to get firsthand information from the man who ran the mint until about 1897 or 98, something like that. And had that man not been living, I think we wouldn't have any information about the mint today. It would have all been lost with history. The next one, please. As we all know, this is how he started the book, and I thought I would include this. He talks about Alamos owing its name to the cottonwood trees from the Spanish word Alamo. Let's see. This is very interesting. In no other book have I learned about the rancheria, which became known to the missionaries shortly after 1610, the Alamos area, where Diego Martinez de signed a peace treaty to the Hacienda. The mission wasn't built at that point in time, but things were going on in Alamos in 1630, immediate area. We know about Coronado coming here in 1540, recording historical information about the mountains, describing the area. He described both of the arroyos that come together, and that's where the group actually camped when Coronado came through. But 1610, that was very interesting for me to learn that, you know, we hear about incorporation of Alamos in 1682 or 83, something like that. So there was something happening here prior to the incorporation, but going back to 1610, that's pretty fascinating. Of course, the reason the Spaniards were up here in the first place was to find silver and to find gold. And they did very well 55 miles from here with not only a major gold find in 1605 and incorporated Chinipas, Chihuahua in 1605, but that mine is still operating today, and it's bigger than ever. It's been operating about 400 years. And most recently, well, 5 years ago, when I was still flying, I would make it a point to fly over the mine periodically, and Chinipas was one of my favorite places to visit because you go over the mountain ridge northeast of Alamos, about 40 miles, and there's a saddle, so you can go through it about 8,000 feet, and then you drop down to about 2,000 feet, spiraling down to Chinipas. And it's a safe flight. It's a little scary, but it actually was a safe flight. There are no cables or wires or towers to worry about from a flying standpoint. Very picturesque, but that mine is just huge today. For a period of years, it was not in operation, and I don't know how many years that it wasn't, but I know with Carlos Acosta and Max Shriver and Dolores Parker's son, we made a trek from here to Chinipas to see the mine by Jeep and multiple Jeeps. And just to give you an idea how rugged that country is, we drove 52 miles. It took 8.5 hours to reach Chinipas. Now, what's very interesting, this past week, it was announced on the internet that the state of Chihuahua is building the road to the Sonoran line. So it might be within our lifetime, my lifetime, next few years, that we'll be able to drive there on a real road. And believe me, it'll be worth the trip. It's a very beautiful, unique, early Spanish colonial village that has been isolated from most of the world until about 25 years ago or so. So anyway, lots of mining in this area and lots of silver and gold production. I'll get back to the script here. Let's see. One thing that he did mention was that, I'll read it. Its importance came, the Alamos importance came with the discovery of rich ores in and around what is now known as Alamos, which at the time was called Real de los Frailes, a name derived from two peaks that overlook the town and which are named Los Frailes. Alamos also was known as Real de Guadalupe, His third name being obtained from the hill that occupies the heart of the town. And it is still known as Cerro de Guadalupe. The discovery of gold, silver, and lead ores occurred sometime between the years of 1683 and 1685. And as you all know, that was right in the Aduana area. Next one, please. In the book, he says the word real, preceding the name of the town, signifies mines. I had a problem with that, and that's why I put in brackets royal mines, because I think that is, Lorna would know if she could respond, but checking other mining areas in Mexico, such as Real de Catorces, which is a fabulous place to visit, by the way, below Saltillo and near Matehuala, Mexico. That is Real de Catorces, the royal mines of Catorces. Yes. I'm sorry, I can't hear. My hearing is so bad, I can't get it. Sorry. Okay. Here's another interesting fact. Those of you that know the history of Sonora, you know that prior to Sonora being created, this was a huge area going from the El Fuerte River in the state of Sinaloa up into Arizona, over onto the Baja, and then it was broken up. I see the word Ostimuri or Alamos. The state, I'm trying to think of, the state back then was called Occidental. Up until 1730, little was known about Alamos, and there was no proper mission history. February the 14th, 1730, the Vistador General Pedro de Rivera sent in a report to the Viceroy in which it appeared that Diego Gudino was located at San Ildefonso de Ostimuri, which he took to mean Alamos. Yeah, there we go. 1767, Alamos was a residence of the lieutenant governor and of the curate. It had a population of 3,400 people. Herbert Bolton, in his guide to materials for the history of the United States and archives of Mexico, portion cites the following references. Here's another interesting fact. You know, we've done some study about the Dianza trek from Alamos to San Francisco, and that was in 1775, of which 50% of the people on that trek were Alamenses. When Dianza stopped here, he stayed here for some time because he needed money, which he was able to obtain. He was able to obtain silver and goods from the wealthy mine owners. And they doubled their numbers while in Alamos from about 150 that came up from Culiacan to here with the captain, and left with about 300 people walking without a trail to San Francisco. The Spanish only knew about the San Francisco Bay area from their ships. There had been no overland access to that region. So this was the very first trek to find the bay. And what is interesting is Captain Dianza in 1737 had that idea. And look how long it took before he actually got his opportunity and the king authorizing this expedition. That was brand new information for him. Yes. Next one, please. By the way, one reason I'm giving you more than what you bargained for about the mint, I don't think there's an hour talk that one could give on the mint. There isn't that much information. But we'll get to that, and I think the mining is as important as the mint. What happened with the mines, the incredible volume of silver and gold that came out of this region. And I put it later, you'll see, in today's dollars terms, based on what it was when they were mining. And you will be most amazed if you don't know about these numbers. There were 13 major mines in the area. We might add that near the, I would call it the John Krutchek property, there was a mill, and you can still see ruins of that mill, not far from the Chocolate Palace, right up the street here. That was
next to him.
Pardon?
That's right next to him.
That's right. Yeah, next to Ann's. That's right. The reason that exists, it wasn't for these 13 mines. The king required any development in the Americas by mining companies and so on, have a public mill for individual miners. So you could have prospectors in Alamos that would go out with their burro daily, come back in with some ore. They had a place then to process it. They couldn't go to the Almada mill or the Urea mill. They had this little spot right in town where they could go up to the top of the hill by Ann's house, dump it on the ground. Gravity would take care of it, taking it down to the bottom to crush the ore, to be able to extract the silver. By the way, most silver mines produce 5% gold. So it's not strictly silver. And as they mentioned here, also lead was a byproduct of the mining too, which had value. Here we go with average annual yield was $345,000. According to this 1884 report, that became $7,762,000. But we will see later in the report, we actually, here we go. The La Quintera produced at least $562 million. Now put that into perspective. Here you've got a town, and it was an outpost. There was nothing north of here in those days. Well, very low. Arispe and some of that area was in existence. But this was almost the end of the road. It certainly was in the 1600s, and then in the 1700s, development north of here. But in today's dollars, $562 million for one family, of which they had their overhead, of course. They had to give 20% of that to the King of Spain. And so what did they do with that kind of money? They bought more ranches, more land. They brought in whatever they wanted from Europe by special order, ladies' dresses, luxury items. It might take a year or two for it to get here, you know, it's not like UPS, but that all had to come by sailing ship, the Vera Cruz, or later the Sea of Cortez and up. So they had unbelievable amount of money. Let's see. I mentioned Chinipas. Batopilas was another major mine. unbelievably rich silver mine. Have any of you been to Batapilas? Okay, good, good. There's a book about Batapilas, and I read it. What was astounding, in that mine, they would find columns of silver, not just a vein. But one description was they had to take machetes into the mine to cut the columns into pieces small enough to load on the burros and mules. So it was virtually pure silver that they were taking out. And Batapilas was so wealthy, by the way, that they had the first electricity in Mexico because he could afford to buy Edison's generating equipment and hook it up to the water, to the river, and all of that. The church was completed in Alamos in 1804 under the reign of Charles IV. You can still see the coat of arms today over the main facade of the building. The next sentence kind of stumped me a little bit. It says, this edifice is the most magnificent of all the missions established in the Northwest. Just a week ago, Jamie had a guest give her a beautiful copy of an 18th century map that is about this tall, that wide, of northern Mexico. And I thought, oh, that's wonderful. You know, it can put Alamos into perspective for guests when they want to know, what it was like in the old days, what existed beyond Alamos and over on the Baja and so on. I couldn't find Alamos. And I thought, well, this is a lousy map, Alamos was the place for this region back in those days. So I asked my son-in-law, Ramon, I said, Ramon, look at this map. They left Alamos off the map. He said, that's a mission map. Those are the missions of northern Mexico. I said, well, I'll be darned. So our church wasn't a mission. He said, no, it wasn't a mission. Here it said it's a mission. So I thought this was interesting. And I want to get an answer to that question. I'll go to the church to find out. I'm sure we'll find out. It was what? Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I keep running around. Okay. Right here?
Yes.
Okay. How many have been to Mako Yahweh? Okay. Well, that's a trip you need to put on the History Club list. I've taken a pilot group up there about 4 years, and I love visiting that area. Dolores Parker was the first one that ever told me about Mako Yahweh, and she went up there for Easter. It's a mission that was built in about 1605, about the same time as Genie Paz, and it's on the Mayo River. Unfortunately, it's on the west side of the Mayo River. So to get there, as the crow flies, it's only about 12 miles, 14 miles from here, something like that. But you have to go 35 miles north to San Bernardo, cross the only bridge that's on the Mayo River, and then come back down on the west side. So it's a wonderful outing. The structure is 40% standing yet. Still a few of the arches, original arches, are still in place up near the altar. It's just a beautiful little village and worth the trip.
Yeah, Jim?
Yes.
We took, Stephanie directed a group of people going to Montreal either a year or two ago. And periodically we do it. It's a wonderful trip. It's like,
It is. And You know, if you go in the springtime, you wouldn't have to go to San Bernardo. You could, and if you have a four-wheel drive, you could drive across the river. So, let's see. The next paragraph, I'll read that and we'll discuss it. Until quite recently, the sacred vessel. Now, he's writing this in about 1932 or 35, right in there. And what had just happened in Alamos between 1926 and 1929 was the Cristero War. And the Cristero War in Alamos, the church was sacked. So all of the figures, the saints, the religious items, vessels were stolen. Actually, stolen wouldn't be quite the right word. As I understand it, and I got this from Edith Pratt, people went to the church. They had a very short warning that the Cristeros were coming into the town. They gathered up all the things they could, took them to their home. I'm told that today there are a few homes with some of the religious figures in place, and they feel that they have been the protectors for almost 100 years, their family, and it's become a family piece instead of something that should go back to the church. So there was a little controversy about that, or there has been through the years by some people in Alamos, but not everything was destroyed. Fortunately, the church was not destroyed. And in other writings, I've read about even the altar rails being solid silver. I also have heard that during the Pancho Villa era, prior to the Cristero War, many of the valuable things were taken then too. So you can only imagine with the quantity of silver that especially the Almadas had, who had their home facing the church, which is today the Portales Hotel and that entire block, which is about 80,000 square feet under roof. You can imagine that they spared no expense on putting plenty of silver in the church. Let's see. Oh, it mentions there was a private chapel in the Almada home south of Alamos. That would have been the Mercedes Ranch. Do all of you know the Almada history on the ranch? It's pretty juicy. Let me give it to you. Almada, again, major mine owner, extremely wealthy. He had a mistress south of town. He had his wife at the big home in the plaza. He raised 14 children with the wife on the plaza and 14 children with his mistress. So she was out of the Mercedes Ranch. Her name was Mercedes. And so the story goes, she became discontent about being out of town and this other woman getting preferential treatment. So he bought what today is the Craig Fisher home, which was a single-story home. Moving in, she became discontented again because here was the other wife up on the plaza, up high, and she wasn't even equal to the church because that street slopes down on Comercio. So she insisted that he change that she be on a level with her competitor or whatever. And he converted that into a two-story home. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but somebody gave me the story once and it's a good one. So he had 28 children, 28 children. And many of those, you know, you can imagine how many descendants there are today. it's got to be just unbelievable. And many of you know some of the Almadas around here. One of my favorite Almada stories is there's a fellow that lives at San Vicente between here and El Fuerte. He's an old rancher. He comes into town periodically, and he's the guy you see with an old red pickup with doors in the back and spurs and cowboy items and so on. And he peddles those in town. And he was my source for so much of what I had in the cantina over a period of about 15 years. So we got to know one another. And I made a comment one day about the wealthy Almadas, and he said, "Not my family." And I said, "Really?" I said, "Well, your family was here during the Almada era, right? With the mine and so on." And he said, "Yes, but my family provided the burros and the mules. We didn't get the silver." He said the way it worked, starting back in the 1600s, to be able to deliver that 20% to the king, the king's fifth, they had to go from Alamos to Mexico City, the El Camino Real, to Veracruz. And as time progressed and volume increased, banditos became a huge problem for that, I don't know, 1,500-mile trek or whatever it would have been. But it was a long ways away and a lot of danger along that way. So the, yes.
I just want to say, in the spring, we're going to have a meeting, a presentation on the Alamos of Alamos. And we're going to have it in the lobby of the Port House. So you can mark your, I don't have the date of it now, but anyway, that will be coming.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. By the way, they mention in the book about the beans being made out of silver at the Mercedes Ranch. And again, that was probably an effort on his part to please his other wife, make it as fancy as he could for her. Let's see. Yeah, the Constitution in 1917 dictated that the churches no longer have any authority whatsoever. When we moved here, at that point in time in 1989, early 90s, a priest could be put in jail for walking in his vestments outside the church. So you'd see Father Carlos going over in his street clothes. And then in the late 90s, you could see some of the young men and Father Carlos and other priests walking through the plaza with their robes and everything. So that changed not that long ago, where the church was able to have a little bit more freedom. And of course, back in 1917, all church property became part of the government. They confiscated everything. The where?
The building itself, I'll help you with that.
Can you take the mask off?
Except the building, Ellen, say it again. Okay. Okay. Okay.
Huh.
Okay. Okay. I think you got that.
Okay. Okay.
Great.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the men. If we can go to the next one. Let's see. Okay. 1825, they're talking 6,000 people in Alamos. I thought that was interesting because I've heard numbers of up to 30,000 were in Alamos. So I'm not sure what period of time that would have been. But I'm guessing since this man, Lieutenant Hardy, was here, he probably had a pretty good handle on having a good number on the number of inhabitants. What I don't know, and I think it would be very interesting, probably some people do know, and I'd love to hear about it, how many people lived at Awana? That probably was the working force for the mines, and that number had to be in the thousands. And we know that from the plague in the late 1700s, 1770s, that hit Alamos, where they estimate 3,000 to 5,000 died in that one plague, and the mines had to close down because most of the people that died were the miners. Okay. I thought it was interesting that here in 1825, he talks about having seen cockfighting, bullfighting, handball, type of handball that I've never heard about before prior to reading this, where they have two walls at right angles, 75 feet high, 150 feet long. That was quite a ball court, called rebote by the locals. The big thing was take a cab ride around the plaza, kind of like today. Let's see. Okay. And gambling among the ladies was the rule instead of the exception. I thought that was pretty interesting too. Next one, please. Now, here's a number on production, 1825, $24,600,000 per year, one single mine. One single mine. Around 1900, the decline came because of, I would say, three reasons. The price of silver went way down. There was a revolution going on, and the local economy went to pot. So business people moved out of Alamos. Yes. That is true. Yeah, and that would have been 1820s. 1820s when Mexico received their independence and the king was out of the picture. The king had the miners over the barrel. They couldn't just go out there and say, well, we're not going to give the king his fifth. They had to give him his fifth because he was the source for mercury. And to actually, it was another Almada who introduced amalgamation to Mexico. And that Almada was the nephew of the first bishop of Sonora in Almada. And the first bishop of Sonora contacted his nephew in Madrid, who was in university studying mining. So he brought amalgamation over, and each time the king would get his fifth, they would send back an allotment of mercury for the Alamos mines. That was part of the trade-off. No money, no mercury. So he had them where he wanted them. By the way, I mentioned the plague, and what happened here in the plague was the mine shut down. The king was very unhappy. And we can thank the king for the garbage pickup here every day of the week, because that's what happened. He sent over engineers and a group to study the health problems of Alamos so the mines could reopen. And lo and behold, they found filth, they found hovels next to mansions, rats, all kinds of things. I don't think probably back then they knew exactly what the cause was, but they knew this town was not clean. So they changed the drainage, improved the streets, outlawed all type of hovel, non-conforming structures not to be built any longer in the town, and daily trash elimination from Alamos. So the king did a very good thing, which we enjoy today. About the only town in Mexico where that happened. I don't know of any other where it's this clean. And I hear that from tourists on a regular basis. Yes. Okay, sure. What, in a nutshell, what happens with the ore, they grind it to a almost powdery consistency. It's all very fine, and the mercury brings the silver to the surface. It all just comes up, kind of a chemical reaction, I guess. I've never seen it done, but I think that's basically what happened. Ramon Corral, that's still a big name in Alamos today. One of our mayors, two of our mayors in the past since I've lived here have been Corrals, and they're direct descendants of Ramon. Ramon was their grandfather, I believe, and he was the vice president of the country. As the information says, he required the government to put in a rail line up to Alamos, and unfortunately it was too late in the day. The mines were already shut down, and it did not revive Alamos. It had a short life here. Eventually, before it ceased operating, they went down to one train a week coming to Alamos, but just a few hundred people remain. I know some of the families personally that whose roots go back to the 1700s, and they've related stories about their ancestors, and they were in business here. The Boers family, the Almada family, the Zaragoza family, and they just had to leave around 1900. Things became too grim, and ironically, even though they did very well here, they went elsewhere and became very successful. All three of those families in particular. They had and still have a very good knack for business.
Yeah, Jim.
Yeah.
I just want to say one thing on Ramon Corral. In 2003 election, Ramon Corral IV ran against Eduardo Boers. Both families are almost families, and they ran for governor. And of course, Boers won. And I thought that was it.
What year was that?
2003.
2003. Okay, good. Okay, let's see. Next one, please. This one, you know, we have a wonderful historian here in town. I love reading all of his writing. And next time I see him, I'm going to ask him if he knows that we had two mints. Because the only place I ever found this information was from Mr. Pradu's book, and he mentions a mint that was established in 1823. Okay, 1828. This man, under license by the federal government, opened a mint here in town. Location, we don't have a clue, and I'm sure it wouldn't have been the present location that we talk about. But they started to coin copper coins, and the coins were rejected by the public. So the mint closed down within 2 years, and I can't help but wonder what is the value on one of those coins, because I follow once in a while. I'll go online and see what is happening with Mexican coins. I'm not a collector. I only have a half dozen coins in all, but I've never seen any copper come up. And if you see copper and it is either of those dates, you've got something that's worth a lot of money if you find one here in town. Later, some copper was produced by the second mint, and not a high production. I think I've got those figures here on the production. So this man had a concession. They produced a coin, as you can see right there, very interesting looking. And we can go on to the next one, please. Let's see. Okay, the second paragraph, we're talking about why did they pick Alamos? Because this was the source. They didn't have to go very far to move the silver and the gold to make coins. Alamos, I don't think, was really known for producing much in the way of gold coins. I do have production figures for every year. It's kind of boring reading, but you know, each type of coin for every year that the mint was open, which is about 30-year span, except during the time of Maximilian, early 1860s, there are no records. So they don't really know what was going on here. Maybe no production, maybe they were still stamping out coins and making a little money on the side, you know, who knows? But so they kept very accurate records on all of the mining operations, as did the Spanish from the time of Cortez in 1520. The records of Bernal Diaz, the scribe and monk who traveled with Cortez, conquest of Mexico, they kept very detailed records. And I suppose that was because they were very accountable to Spain. They probably had to give reports on everything that was going on. So that part of the history of the mint is impeccable. Okay, next one. And next one. Okay, the mint itself, we all know the school Paulita Baran, and that is the site where the mint building was in the 1800s. Okay, they showed one, they're conflicting dates, but 1868 might be the right date for the opening of the mint. If not, within a year or two of that would have been pretty close. And it went until about 1897, I believe. Next one, please. You know, the history here is so rich, and that's why you're all here, and that's why Errol does this great job of running the history club. But every time I walk out the front door of the hotel and see Margot's house across the street, I immediately think Margot Finley's house, or what was her home, about the story that she told me about the little octagonal window on the side street. It's only about that big. And that is where the former federal troops who lived in Alamos kept a sniper holding Maximilian's troops at bay for a period of time. The sniper killed about 30 of the troops because they were trying to come up from Perico, that little narrow street, and that little window faced right down the street. And then the actual battle, once the troops made it through, happened between Steve McKelvey's house and the end of our hotel. Short 2-block street. The whole battle took place right there. And the street became Calle Molina because Colonel Molina, Colonel or General, forget. Do you know, Kev? He was killed on the street, plus another officer. And the general, the tomb is under the big tree, Rosales, thank you, at the cemetery. And then later his body was exhumed and moved to Mexico City.
I found bullets in my wall.
I'm sorry?
Bullets in his wall.
The bullets in the wall.
Yeah.
In my wall was hot.
Yeah, very good, Steve. Let's see. Okay. Let's see. Okay. Here's another interesting part. I've heard about some of the early mints having hand presses where they could exert enough pressure to do the coins, but they actually had a steam operated press here plus hand press. So the early Spanish coins that we see in Mexico or see online from the 1600s, I think the first mint was still in the 1500s. They started minting coins. But those were all hand pressed, and in gold being soft, it was fairly easy to do, and they were always irregular. It was up to the mint master to certify that the weights were correct on the coins, and he was accountable, very accountable, because his initials went on every single coin. So if somebody would find one, you know, at 3/4 weight or whatever, well, it would be the mint master who, you know, I don't know if that ever happened, but the various mint masters, there were 4 or 5 in Alamos, their initials go on the coin. The way to know if you have an Alamos coin is look for the letter A. Very easy to spot. And the various mints in Mexico carried identifying letters indicating which mint the coin was created. Let's see. Don Manuel Lara Gibel, he was the last mint master, and that's the man that was still living in the 1930s in Navajo, who provided all the information for the book that was created about the Alamos Mint. Let's see, next one, please. Okay, there's your mint mark. It could be A or S. All of the coins that I've seen have just been the A. And I had a kind of a fun experience about 1992. I was down the Alameda, and there was a man that lived one door from the bus station to the east. And distinguished man, about 6'4", in his maybe upper 70s or early 80s. And I walked by one day and he said, "Senor, would you like to buy a watch?" And I said, "What kind of a watch?" He said, "Well, I have one in my house." He said, "Come with me." And what he did astounded me. And it's something that would not be recommended in today's world. He took me back into the living room, back into a bedroom. There's a safe this tall, huge thing. And he works the combination, opens the door, and here's just loads of Alamos silver coins. Couldn't believe my eyes. And I didn't ever tell anyone in town about that for fear the word would go out and something would happen. And he reached down and he showed me this pocket watch, which I still have today. And it's a beautiful multi-dial pocket watch made in about 1880 in Switzerland. So, let's see. So what I'm saying is there are people that hoarded coins from the mint through multiple generations, and finds were made at various times by people working on their homes, opening a floor. Best story I've ever heard, wasn't local, but we had a guest here from Puebla, and her husband is Mr. Jarvis of Jarvis Wine in Napa Valley. So she came from a very wealthy family going back into the 1700s. And her grandfather, out at the old Hacienda, she said one day he was working on one of the arches and the columns, and right above the column, he was whacking the plaster, and the wall opened up, and it was solid coins coming out all the way down to the ground. And she said it was like a fortune in coins. He had just discovered that no one knew was there. So there were no banks, and that's what you had to do. Some people used their wells to hide money in the wells. Now, the story I can give you from Judy McLean is kind of a good one. Judy and Mary, Dr. Mary, owned the home, which is our spa today. Well, that property back in the 1800s was the back end of the mint. So stories developed after the mint closed about the well having treasure. And Judy said, you know, after we bought that place and started building the home, we put the word out one day that we wanted to have the well cleaned. And the next morning, there was a line going clear down the street of Mexicans wanting to clean the well for free. Now, I've never told this story before, but I'm going to, only because no, I shouldn't. Maybe I should.
Oh,
Okay, all
yeah.
right, I will.
You
Okay.
gotta tell them, yeah.
Well, Judy related that story to me because part of her story had to do with a legend that a monk had hidden the silver in that well. It wasn't the mint operators, had to do with a monk. In our first, we rented that as a home that we lived in for a year from Judy and Mary. And my son-in-law and other daughter, Jody, saw a ghost multiple times in that area at night, even in their bedroom. And I kind of thought, oh, well, I wonder what, you know, what were they drinking? So George, my son-in-law, one morning after they got up, he said, it was unreal last night. This guy was at the foot of our bed and he just couldn't get over it. I said, well, what did he look like? And George was a very good artist. So we're sitting there having breakfast and he sketches this figure with holding an olla or a pot up on his shoulder, and he had on a monk's robe and a hood. It was very easy to see it was a monk. Our maid, Rosario, she came out of the kitchen. By the way, she was illiterate, couldn't understand a word we were saying, and couldn't read or write in Spanish. She said, that's him. I said, Rosario, what do you mean that's him? That's the man I see here every day. I said, you see a ghost? She said, oh yeah. She says, I have one at my home. And he drives us crazy. It's a child ghost, and he drives us crazy because he plays a drum all day. But figure that one out. The maid, who didn't know what we were talking about, anything, says, "That's the guy that's here while I'm working." So anyway, we had the well cleaned. Didn't find a thing, only mud. This is a list of the mint masters going 1864 to 1895. So what, 31 years the mint was in operation. You're going to have a program on the tunnels of Alamos. And fortunately, trying to think of the man's name. Pardon me?
Nemesio.
Yes, Figueroa, thank you. He came over and went through our portal one day, identified the tunnel going from our well down the portal and going to the street, but then a second branch off of it went straight into a wall, which would have been the Mexican Mint. So he said, there's no question that a tunnel went into the Mint. I said, well, that makes sense because during this period of time, the front part of our hotel, Molina Ocho, was leased by the Mint for the Mint manager. They wanted him to live right at the Mint. So I think what Figueroa came up with was probably right on. We'll know in time, I think, as they open up some of these streets and so on, about the tunnel network that we have in Alamos. Let's see. Next one, please. The earlier coinage, I would say, was an impressed impression into the silver or gold. And then later it became a raised impression like coins that we know today. And probably that was a matter of just not having good enough equipment to really create a nice image with the raised type. So this is an example of one. A little hard to tell what's there, but you can see the eagle with the snake in its mouth, and the Alamos A at the bottom. That thing that looks like a beehive has significance to do with Dolores Hidalgo, and he wore a kind of a top-knot type of hat, and that represents Dolores Hidalgo and the rebellion against Spain. Next one, please. Oh, and that is gold, I guess. Yeah. So a gold coin, the one shown there, was the only coin that was minted here. I think most all of, by the way, the Alamos production was low in comparison to almost every mint in the country. It wasn't a major mint, and I think that's why it only lasted 30 years. Hermosillo went into production, it became a city, and that's where the mint operation went. Shortly before this closed, Hermosillo went into operation. So, okay. Let's see. There's your coinage numbers in gold, very small amount. Next one, please. Okay. Yeah, I've not seen any of those. If you Google coin auctions, you'll be able to hit one or two sites that you can indicate on their site what countries coinage you're looking for. So I'll get a notice maybe once every few months that an Alamos coin is going up for sale in the US. And a large, what used to be real, would be the large silver peso, would what would have originally been worth about $1 in exchange, be about 100 to 200, depending on condition. And again, if you put the word out locally that you're looking for Alamos coins, they'll come to your door. They're out there. They are out there. But usually way overpriced compared to what the market is. So, okay. Action, please. Okay, that's a 50
Those
cent top.
nice coins that comes to your door. Trying to get my face here. You said there were not many copper coins that you could find. I can't get a very good image for you. But this is dated 1860. It has a hole which was worn as a pendant for many years. But my guess is there's a chance it came from Alamos. To the outburst. I'll send you a photo of this, Jim, so we can talk about it more.
What was the date, Steve?
The date is 1860 and it's copper. My understanding is these mints minted more copper coins than they did silver coins. There's nobody like them.
60 for copper.
I'd like to see it.
Yeah.
Okay.
I
Do you see a mint mark on it?
Excuse me?
Is there a mint mark?
No, there's not a mint mark. The obverse is not Hidalgo. And but it's clearly dated and it's a quarter real, which is, that's a lot of money in those days. Not centavo.
Quarter real.
Yeah, well, I'd like to. Yeah, you might have something there. I'm glad you brought that up because there was coinage produced at Aduana, but those were all for the miners. And you hear about having to pay the company store. When Nancy and I lived in a mining town in Colorado, Trinidad, I was able to learn about how the system worked back then. And the miners would get a great deal of their pay in mine coinage. And I saw one from the Aduana mine that says Aduana right on it. It's only good at the company store. So the mine owners were able to make money from their employees by selling them everything they needed, you know, their food and supplies and so on. So they gave them a double whack. Okay, next one, please. How are we doing on time?
Oh, yeah, we're a little over, but go ahead.
Okay. Let's see. All right, this is the newer design, and the majority of what would be seen from the Alamos Mint would be this design, regardless of which coin it would be. The eagle again. Let's see. I'm seeing an A right down at the bottom.
Yeah.
So that isn't the Alamos coin. Okay. Next one. And this would be the earlier style of 25 centavo piece, 1886. Next one. The 1 real. The upright eagle, let's see. Have any of you watched Narco on Netflix?
No.
Good, good. We watched an episode this week and they had the most unique footage on there in full color. You know, we see the eagle on top of the nopal cactus with a rattlesnake in its mouth. They had it live, and I couldn't believe it. How'd they ever get that photo or video? It was signified in the story Mexico. Okay, next one, please. These, that's a Henson novel. They went into the metric system after leaving Spain, creating similar to the U.S. system. In fact, somewhere I read that they got the idea from the United States coinage to go this route and drop the Spanish system of coin. Okay, and next one we discussed that. Okay, the mint closed in 1895. The machinery, the dyes, the steam press, and all of that went to Culiacan. And it was maybe 10 years ago when I was able to get a copy of this book from Dr. Hayward, who lived on Comercio. He had the book and he made a copy of it for me. So that's how I was able to get this information. The book isn't, you don't see it every time. So everything was shipped down there. But I couldn't help but wonder, back in the 90s, somewhere around this town, probably there's an old steam unit that they used in the mint. So this answered that question. Everything was moved out. And the next one, I think that's the last one. Okay, the demise of the building. This answers that question. It became an assayer's office until 1915 or somewhere around there. Think about 1915, then the assayer no longer was needed now. Most of the mines had closed. There was nothing for him to work with. And then in 1927, what's interesting here, 24 inches of rain in 72 hours in December. Those of you that were here in the 90s, we had one December with 7 inches, and that was awesome. That really, really helped the area with our aquifer. So, okay, so the building disintegrated, and then later the school Alita ran. I think that's the last one now. Okay, that's what it looked like. And that's the end of the story.